The International Monetary Fund is under fire for humiliating African countries seeking loans from this US-based institution. So what can African leaders do to avoid those embarrassing trips to Washington? Many natural landmarks in Africa still have colonial names, and now there are increasing calls for change. So why has it taken long for African countries to dump European names imposed on the continent? To discuss the humiliation of African countries at the International Monetary Fund, we have contacted Irene Asua. She is a Kenyan-based social scientist and human rights activist. And for more on the growing calls to eradicate colonial names in Africa, we are joined by Dr. Alexander Rosero. Now, he is the convener of the State of Africa lecture series at the Institute of Pan-African Narratives in Zimbabwe. The International Monetary Fund has been making headlines for the wrong reasons in Africa. This institution, based in Washington, D.C., offers loans to struggling African nations under harsh conditions, which particularly impact the poor. Between 2020 and 2022, the IMF provided more than $50 billion to sub-Saharan African countries, making the continent a major borrower at the institution. However, it is not a walk in the park for African countries to obtain IMF loans. Kenya's Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Economic Planning, John Mbadi, has revealed how African countries are humiliated at the IMF headquarters. He cited his recent trip to Washington, D.C., where he and other African ministers were forced to line up in a corridor to request IMF loans. Now, this incident came months after Kenyans protested against a finance bill imposed by the IMF at the end of June 2024. Demonstrators said IMF and World Bank loans are modern-day slavery. Amid the gloom, there is hope on the horizon. The BRICS group is set to create an alternative to the exploitative International Monetary Fund. So will African countries seize this opportunity?
IMF humiliates Africans. High-level delegations from Africa traveled to Washington, D.C. last October to attend the 2024 International Monetary Fund and World Bank annual meetings. Other African countries also attended the meetings. Critics say these meetings are not based on mutual respect and that African delegations are regularly embarrassed.
Kenya's Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Economic Planning, John Mbadi, recounted the condescending attitude by IMF and World Bank officials.
The first one, Chairman, you're right that I was embarrassed at Washington, not that we were treated badly, Your Excellency. I wanted just to clarify. But you see, when you find African countries queuing in corridor, then you are called one by one. Nigeria, you come. 15, 30 minutes. Rwanda, Kenya, for those of us who have some pride, it's a bit demeaning. And you see the money that we are asking for out there, Your Excellency, if we just tighten our system, we can do without some of these monies.
The sight of African finance ministers lined up, resembling students waiting for their turn to see the principal is quite disturbing. Now, this is the harsh reality faced by the recently appointed Kenyan Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury. Now, what's your take on this statement by the Kenyan minister regarding humiliation of top African officials visiting the Bretton Woods institutions in Washington, D.C.?
First, I think that statement was very ahistorical, given the nature of the Bretton Woods institutions and why they were set up in the first place. It was also very interesting for an African minister to say they were embarrassed and humiliated when that is what those institutions have indeed been doing to the African continent and for the Africans for the longest time. These were institutions that were set up when the African continent was still under the first phase of colonialism and slavery. And even after that first phase with the nominal or the flag or paper independence that we got, Africa still inherited debt despite being under slavery and colonialism. So decades later, after getting nominal independence, meaning we didn't really get the economic independence from these institutions, it is a historical and ironical to say that you are humiliated by institutions that were in fact designed to humiliate Africans.
In trying to mitigate the humiliation at the IMF, the Kenyan Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Economic Planning proposed an increase in taxation. He stated that if the country tightens tax collections, it can do without some of these loans. However, experts argue that increasing taxes on the already overburdened taxpayers will not solve Kenya's budget deficit.
Taxation of people who are already being pushed into the periphery economically, or people who are already being pushed into poverty, has never resolved the debt crisis. And so that's not going to work. It hasn't worked before, and it's not, I don't know. In the future, I am not sure if it's going to work. Kenya in the past decade has pushed more people into the poverty bracket. In the past regime, we had poverty double in the country. In this regime, I'm not sure, but with the economic situation and the increase of taxes and the increase of prices of basic utilities that people need, I can bet that more and more people have been pushed into poverty. And so people are not in a position to continue squeezing themselves, being that they're already in poverty. The alternative to not taking loans is ensuring that resources that are on the continent are used on the continent, and that we are able to prevent the loot and the plunder and the loads of resources and money that Africa loses through minerals, through taxes that corporations and individuals that pay for immunity and come here for tax holidays don't pay, through the dismantling of the global financial architecture.
Last June, a significant protest erupted in Kenya, where outraged youth demonstrators stormed the Kenyan parliament. This protest was a direct reaction to the Finance Bill 2024, which had been approved by the Kenyan parliament despite widespread opposition. The bill, heavily influenced by the IMF reform package, included controversial taxation proposals.
The IMF claims to assist African countries, but in fact, its policies hurt the poorest in the continent. Now, is impoverishing Africans the hidden agenda of the IMF?
Yes, it is deliberate, because that's why the IMF was set up in the first place, to keep countries that they were looting and plundering and indebted, and so that we don't have the right to develop. And first of all, the IMF does not have any authority or moral obligation in any manner to dictate how Africa organizes its economy. And it is such a shame that African leaders are mostly puppets of these institutions.
The World Bank and IMF are now seen by many as part of the problem facing African economies. Russia, which chairs the BRICS group this year, has called on its partners to create an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. Africa is now looking for viable and non-colonial alternatives to the predatory Bretton Woods institutions.
Africa is able to dictate its own terms, in terms of trade, in terms of exchange of anything, and in any arena really globally. And the other alternative that I see is a kind of a South-South cooperation, because the North-South relationship over the years has been very predatory and very unequal and very imbalanced, with one person calling the shots and then the rest of the the rest of the 2/3 of the world's population follows. So for me, a viable alternative is a unification of Africa with a South-South, a strengthened South-South relationship, and of course now exploring other international ties, but with very clear terms, with clear balance and checks, and not the imbalance and the inequality that we have seen over the years within the so-called North and South.
African countries such as Egypt, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Kenya, and Angola account for over 40% of the IMF's loan volume to Africa. Now, these countries are rich in natural resources, yet they have to run to the IMF for loans to run their economies. Analysts say a new paradigm is needed in Africa, in which African countries focus on creating wealth via adding value to minerals. Now, will this solve Africa's debt problem?
Yes, it will. Like I said, Africa has abundant, like more than enough resources for the current population and even for the future generations, and also even to support other economically deprived people out of the continent that might also be in need of such resources to propel. And so a new paradigm that Africa has a right to development where we dictate and we have our own trajectory of development and not necessarily following the colonial trajectory of development as we are doing now. So where we have sovereignty over our natural resources, and we have equipped and upskilled the people on the continent to be able to fuel and propel that development that is needed. For me, it's a very big possibility, and it is something that I can visualize. An Africa that has sovereignty over its natural resources.
Well, African leaders do not need to go to Washington with a begging bowl if countries in the continent have sovereignty of their natural resources. I would like to thank our guest, Irene Asua, a social scientist and human rights activist, for her incisive analysis. And we now take a short break before our next topic on shedding colonial names in Africa.
Shedding colonial names in Africa.
Over the last few years, we have seen an awakening sweeping across Africa, where people are calling on their governments to rename landmarks that are a sad reminder of the painful colonial era. Imposing alien names on geographical features by colonialists was one of the ways used to enforce European identity on African heritage. Natural wonders such as Lake Victoria in East Africa and the Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe were named after the British monarch. African officials and academics are now calling for the removal of remaining signs of oppression and believe that oppressed masses in the continent deserve healing through reclaiming their landmarks. There is increasing political goodwill for action. In Zimbabwe, the ruling ZANU-PF party says European names in the country should be changed because they aggrandize colonialism. So why are colonial names still in use across Africa decades after independence?
Africa is a post-colonial continent grappling with shedding colonial identities. The decolonization of Africa's geographical sites can be part of forming a global order without imperialism.
Renowned Kenyan professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o speaks here on how colonialists erased the identity of the colonized by renaming the places they conquered.
The colonial process does, or any process of domination, is first of all, the erasure of the memory of the subjugated, right? You literally erase the memory of who they are, their memory of the past, the memory of their being, as a people. So after erasing that memory, you plant another memory. You can see this when people have colonized another territory, the first thing you do is change actually the name of the territory they have conquered.
Well, it's quite baffling that Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, one of the wonders of the world, still has a colonial name instead of the local indigenous name, Mosiatunia, meaning the smoke that thunders. Now, why has it taken this long to shed the image of colonialism and change the name of these massive waterfalls?
It's all about colonial logics. As much as we claim to be independent as African states in general and Global South in particular, there are people who really think the whole planetary Earth belongs to them and to them alone, and that any other species also belong to them, including the natural features and inhabitants of those places. So we have been thingified. We are viewed as commodity. So the colonial logic will tell you that a certain dead white man visited Africa, visited Zimbabwe, and discovered majestic Mosiatunya Falls. Yet these falls have been with the people for as long as the earth existed. So how do you characterize a situation where I go to Britain and say I have discovered this bridge, I have discovered this mountain? So it's hilarious to say the least, but the whole idea is that this is a colonial logic.
To conquer the continent, the colonialists weaponized the ethnicities of the continent. For instance, in Zimbabwe, the naming of the provinces was part of the colonialist divide and rule tactics. Analysts say it is critical to shed this colonial legacy in Zimbabwe and indeed across Africa.
I think this is critical because remember, the states that we call ours, the sovereignty that we claim we have in Africa, its sovereignty whose umbilical cord is still attached to the illegal Berlin Colonial Conference of 1884 to 1885. So on top of that, we can then not rely on the artificialities that have been imposed through these colonial logics. That is the issue of the tribe. That is the issue of the provincialization of states that took place. You cannot have 44 years after independence, have a certain place you call Matabeleland or Manicaland or Mashonaland. So these are sustained divide and rule tactics, as you rightly point out. But more importantly, these are future seeds of fissures that these colonialists deliberately sowed amongst the Africans, because whenever there is a conflict, eventually the conflict will take a regional face, will take a tribal face, will take an ethnicity place, which for most of the time, these issues are very artificial as they are colonially imposed. So as much as we cannot reverse the illegally imposed colonial borders amongst and between Africans, there are certain things that we can surely reverse with political will, and issues of provincialism is one of them. You cannot build a nation when collectively that kind of a nation still has got provinces identified by artificial ethnicities, because the people have spread all over the country and they have a right to belong to whatever province they so desire.
On this matter of renaming African landmarks, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a world-renowned Kenyan writer, has been vocal. In his book, Decolonizing the Mind, he says European colonialism fragmented the region. In his keynote speech during a public dialogue lecture at the University of Fort Hare, East London campus in South Africa, he is quoted to having said, "You need to do something about the name of this city and its streets. You need to take all those names, put them in an envelope, and write, return to sender." Now, what's your view on this statement?
Ngugi wa Thiong'o's a phenomenal text, Decolonizing the Mind. It's actually a summary of the discussion that we are having right now, where for most of the time, colonization did not only take place physically. The physical colonization that denotes to the issues of physical occupation of the global empire, the human epic movement of the Europeans, the whites, coming to forcefully seize Africa's territories, occurred simultaneously with what we call the cognitive colonization, where our mental faculties were also colonized, where our reasoning, our imaginations, our epistemologies, knowledge systems, our languages, lingual, they were all victims of the same process. So there is no way we can progress if our minds are still colonized.
Coinciding with anti-racist protests that swept the world in 2020, calls increased in Africa to rename Lake Victoria, which lies in Tanzania, Uganda and Kenya. Known as Africa's Pride, the lake was named after Queen Victoria by British explorer in the 1850s. PLO Otieno Lumumba, a renowned Kenyan scholar, said these landmarks continue to have colonial names because African countries have not been sufficiently angry at racism and colonization.
I concur to the fact that you cannot have post-independence identity that identifies us with the very same vices that have subjugated us under rape, under forced labor, under robbery, under banditry, and most importantly, under the most extreme forms of humiliation. So there is no way you can walk in Europe and find a Chaminuka monument. You will never find a Mbuyane monument. I'm using examples of my own country, Zimbabwe. So it's very ironical because we have ceased to be colonial subjects and we have ceased to be colonial objects. So the only way Africa can be autonomous in as much as claiming its a full expression of our independence and decolonization is also to decolonize the names, is also to do away with those colonial attachments, colonial identities, because colonial identities are a way of colonizing memory and reminding future generations that there is no way you can claim your identity if that kind of identity is not associated with the erstwhile.
Several countries in Africa changed their names after political independence because they were slurs that demean their culture and deny their accomplishments as civilizations. As recently as 2018, Africa's last sovereign monarchy, then known as Swaziland, commemorated the golden jubilee of its country's decolonization from Imperial Britain by changing its name to the present-day Kingdom of Eswatini. Now, what is the importance of such decisions to the people of Africa?
Yeah, as I have already alluded to earlier, issues of naming, they are very much attached to issues of memory. And there is no civilization that can take place outside memory. So memory is the precursor of any given form of civilization. So you will never find a Japanese brand with a European name. You will always find your Daihatsu, you will find your Hyundai, etc., your Toyota, etc. It will never happen that an American invention will have a Botswana name, a Zimbabwe name. So that is only naturally expected to take place with regards to Africa, including even the names of our states and the names of our kingdoms. We can't have a state called South Africa. That's hilarious to say the least, because South Africa has got a non-name, that is Azania. So when you have Swaziland saying, no, originally we were Eswatini, yes, they are rightful to say that.
Well, indeed, the movement for total decolonization of Africa is unstoppable. I would like to thank Dr. Alexander Rusero from Zimbabwe for his insight today. And that's it for this week's edition of Africa Today. It's always great having you watch the show. You can watch this episode and all of previous shows on our website, presstv.ir. From me, Mubarak, Kenya, and the entire crew, it's goodbye for now.